About 3 months ago, we were back for a friend's wedding in Austin, Texas with my parents. And I was in a taxi cab with my mom, and the driver was saying, "Where are you from?" No, like, "Where are you from?" In a very aggressive way to my mom. And it wasn't something that was curious or open. It was very like, y'all know how it's done. And I was getting fired up. And at the end of the cab ride, I got out and I was like, "Mom, why didn't you say anything?" And she's like, "Why would I step below like my level? Like, he's never gonna be at our level. So why would I try to step down from it?" It's so graceful. And here I am, and I'm like thinking, oh my God, like our generation has gotten so fired up about this that we're like overcompensating for the former generations. And it was just this moment where I'd never like stood up for race in front of my mom. But then I also realized there's a time and a place for when you do that.
We're joined today by Leigh Tran, Director and Head of Communications at Dropbox, and Bree Bunzel, Head of Global Customer Marketing, also at Dropbox. Leigh heads up communications for Dropbox across the Asia Pacific and Japan region and is a co-lead for the APAC Dropbox Asian ERG Group, aka Employee Resources Group, along with Bree. She's also currently working on a side hustle project to help tackle the problem of fast fashion by building a fashion upstart, and was recently selected to be part of Fishburner's 2022 Tech for Good Founders program. Holding a Bachelor of Law and Communications, she's previously also worked at Salesforce, IBM, and Ogilvy. Bree leads customer marketing at Dropbox, and as mentioned, is the co-lead with Leigh for the APAC Dropbox Asian ERG Group. Bree was born and raised in Silicon Valley, growing up in a mixed-race household with a Korean-American upbringing. She moved to Australia 8 years ago and now is a proud dual citizen of the United States and Australia. Great to have the two of you on the Level Asian podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We always like to go right back to the beginning. So let's start with you, Leigh. Can you walk us through what your upbringing within your family was like, and also where you grew up?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the western parts of Sydney. We're back here today, so lots of memories. So my parents were actually from Vietnam, and like many Vietnamese people of their generation, they left their country because of the war, and they came to Australia as asylum seekers. I don't remember a lot of those early days, but I just, I know it was really tough for them to come to a country to start over again, essentially. And I always say that they came to Australia with empty hands, broken dreams, but hopeful hearts. And so I think that has always stayed with me in terms of my mantra, to just really go for it in life. So we grew up on welfare. We didn't have a lot of money, and I went through the public school system. I didn't feel different because in Western Sydney, all my friends grew up in that same background, and it was normal to have parents who didn't speak English and to speak a different language at home and to eat very traditional Asian food or multicultural food. So I didn't feel like we had a different upbringing in any way, because I felt like we had a really multicultural and diverse community around us. So it was a lovely childhood. It was tough, but it was empowering. It was a great way to build resilience and appreciation for what we have. So that was my sort of upbringing in Western Sydney. And then I went to Sefton High School, which I know many of your past guests share the same education background. And I would say, I decided on a really different career path. I did do law, which I know is very Asian parental approved, but I also did communications, which is very different. And at the time, I didn't really know what communications entailed. And I just knew that I loved language and I loved English and I loved humanities. And so I thought that sounds kind of up my alley. So I decided to do a double degree in law and communications. And when I went to university, which is UTS, I think that was a bit of a turning point for me, because that's when I first felt different, because I was the only Asian person in any given classroom, particularly in communications, because it was it wasn't a very popular career choice or course for an Asian person. So I think I felt like, okay, no one looks like me here. And I do feel a little bit out of my depth. And I would say it was the first time I felt that I was confronted by where I'd grown up, which was Western Sydney, and the fact that my parents didn't have a network. They didn't have a business network. So, when you go to university, you meet these students who went to private schools and their parents work for large law firms and consulting firms. And it was the first time I thought, okay, I've worked really hard to get to where I am, and maybe hard work isn't going to be enough for me.
I feel like that migrant story is very common with parents, how they don't shield you, but they protect you in a way that you don't feel like you're disadvantaged, so that they can still bring you the best life as well. And we've had a lot of guests on who say once they go to university, that's when the shock factor hits, because you're in a pool of a mix of different people, not just in your area, who are going through the same kind of struggles, I guess, and growing up in that similar environment. Yeah,
it's so true. And I think, growing up in the Western bubble, you get sheltered a little bit. And you think that that's reality, and then you go into like the big world or the big smoke, and you realize actually the world's a little bit different. So it was pretty confronting and a little bit scary.
Was there a huge turning point in university or an experience that you came across that made you realize there was a huge shift between your childhood versus other people?
When I was studying, because I was studying law, as mentioned, and a really pinnacle part of guaranteeing whether you would make it as a law student and actually getting a job in a law firm is to get these summer internships or these clerkships in law firms. And I just knew I did not have a chance, because it was all about networks and who your parents knew, who your family knew. And so I think there was just that realization that I don't think I'm going to make it. And I don't think that my MO of just like work really hard and try and get great marks, and I just felt like it's probably not going to be enough.
Yeah. I can relate to where you're coming from, because it's like once you get into the course that you're going into and you realize there's all these people that nepotism exists, and it feels like you're pushed down in the system as well. Bree, with your accent and within the intro, you didn't grow up in Australia, but you've also had a Korean mum and a German-Irish father in the US that we've spoken about. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in the States and being mixed Asian, as well as what inspired or prompted you to come to Australia?
So I grew up in Silicon Valley, which is a crazy bubble to look back on and think that I ended up somewhat sane, to be honest. So as you mentioned, my mom is Korean first generation. My dad is, I believe, fourth generation German-Irish. They actually met on an airplane, which is a pretty cool story.
Wow.
They locked eyes, and he chatted quick enough before the end of the flight to lock in a first date,
Was
which
it a
is
long
crazy.
flight or a short flight?
Yeah, it was a long haul, but I mean, he talked fast enough. So I grew up mixed race, and my Hamoni and Habuji, my Korean grandparents, actually moved over from Seoul, I believe, when I was 3 or 4, and both my parents were working full time, so they helped raise us. And so we had a very deep cultural immersion into the Korean culture. And I think one of the first moments where I felt different was actually in childhood. It's a very classic story that many Asian Americans can relate to, but bringing your lunch to school. And they made this amazing bibimbap, and it had, I don't know if y'all had like thermoses with the layers, you got to keep it all warm, and there's like all these things going on in there. And you bring it to school, and it's like you love that meal, and you open your lunch and you realize for the first time that you're different, and everyone else has a paper bag with white bread and ham and cheese. And all I wanted in this moment, when everyone's starting to like make fun of me, is to just have a white bread sandwich. And the most painful moment for me to look back on, to think that time, is how much love was put into those meals. And I just felt so much shame. That was so much a love language, as with many Asian families, of food as a source of support. And I remember throwing that away and going and buying a sandwich from the lunch line, because I just wanted to fit in. And that became a continuous theme throughout my upbringing and even adulthood, in terms of fitting in and trying to just shrink into the mold. So that was actually something I didn't even realize was formative at the time, but became part of my story. I definitely celebrated a lot of Korean cultures. We had American Thanksgiving, but my Korean grandparents would bring all Korean food. So it was like this weird hybrid mix, but people loved it in my family. The first time I likely felt more different, I would say like Silicon Valley is quite a melting pot. A lot of people immigrate from different regions in Asia, especially for engineering, for tech, et cetera. But I went to school in the Midwest. So I went to school at Wisconsin, and there were many people there that had never even seen an Asian person. And if it was an Asian person, it was the Chinese restaurant in their town. And so that was their one data point. And so for me, I thought I had known myself. Like, we all still are working on that. But in my 20s, I was thinking, how am I now feeling all these microaggressions and not really understanding where it comes from and not knowing how to like handle it? Because I never really dealt with that in my childhood. So similar to Leigh, it was something later in life that I had to go and experience. So then after the Midwest, moved back to the Silicon Valley area for my first job. And I was in that job for about 4 years. I worked at a company called Intuit QuickBooks, accounting software, very sexy. If you can learn how to market for accounting software, you can do anything. And at the time I believe my mid 20s. And this is a theme we'll probably get into later, but because I was mixed, I could lean conveniently into either side depending on when it was convenient. And I think for the part of my life where I was trying to assimilate, I typically dated more white men. And I had a big breakup of 4 years and I thought my life was over, but I had associated so much of my identity to him and my sense of worth and my sense of belonging and all these things that I needed to figure out for myself. So as you do, you flee the country. And so I moved to Australia as a way to cure my broken heart, thinking it'd be like a 1-year stint. And so began this whole new chapter that I'm now, I can't believe I'm still here, now citizen in, but to really understand a bit more of who I am and basically undo everything I did leading up to that point. So it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, wow. What did you do in that 1 year period? Or did you come here and find a new role?
Yeah, so I had about a year in the US to kind of figure out between the breakup and what happened, what was next. I actually applied to business school, very, again, Asian parent thought process of success. And also to prove to everyone, like, I'm good, I still got it, even though I'm like, my heart was shattered. And I realized I didn't get into the school that I wanted. And part of it was my intention wasn't even there. And they probably could read that through the admission essay. And at that point I was like, am I not good enough? Like, what's next? And coincidentally, the week I got the rejection letter was the week the company Intuit at the time in Australia had opened their Sydney office and said, we're looking for a marketer. So it was just like one of those sliding door moments where you're just like, all right, sweet, I'm going to move to Australia and this is the path for me. So moved here, and then I thought I'd be here for a year. So I was thinking of it like, okay, I got all IKEA furniture. This is going to be a temporary thing. We're just going to hang out, enjoy, do all the fun touristy things, explore Australia. And then, after a year, I developed actually my first solid group of Asian girlfriends. And that was a pivotal point for me because it was a sense of belonging where you can actually joke about these things that you never could with your white friends. And nothing wrong with my friends that are white that are also amazing and understanding, but it just brought this level of community that made me feel a lot more of a sense of belonging than I ever had before.
It's almost like the puzzle piece that you can finally fit in as.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
What was your first impression of Australia when you first got here?
Oh my goodness. I mean, okay, so first of all, the media sets the wrong expectations on lots of things. I mean, we have the Hemsworths, we have like Crocodile Dundee, we have
Home and Away.
Home and Away, all that, and then I think also like American Girls are like the Aussie accent, like, oh my God, it's like this whole thing. So you go in, and I'll be honest, like my first year felt like a fairy tale, like in the sense that it was magical. I mean, you're near beaches, you're near the city. Everyone's quite friendly. I loved it. I felt like the challenges were more like figuring out where my groove was and who my new friends were in this new space. And also a chance to like reinvent myself in a space where I was changing and I had the opportunity to. I think when you live back home, you're around the friends that you grew up with. And so you kind of fit the stereotype or the role that you played when you were younger, and also within your family upbringing as well. So then being able to like reinvent that in a space where no one knows who you are or what your background is.
Yeah, travel's such an interesting thing because we've sort of seen that theme across some of the guests that we've had on. And some sort of see it as running away. Others see it as just the fact of being anonymous in like a big city or in somewhere foreign. It's like very liberating to be able to just, reinvent yourself essentially, right? And sometimes you have to put on a persona where you grew up and around the people that you were when you're sort of young as well. I sort of want to fast track it and just try and understand where Dropbox actually came into play, because you came from obviously two completely different backgrounds. So maybe I'll start with Leigh. How did you first start working for Dropbox and then made your way up to where you are now? Yeah,
so I fell into tech. So I didn't get the summer clerkship in law firms, obviously, but I was able to get my first job in comms at a PR agency in Surrey Hills. It was like before Surrey Hills was cool. It was before startups were cool. But it was a great entry into just understanding what's the world of PR and what's the world of communication. So I landed that job. And by accident, it was tech. So I had no idea about the tech world. I did not like technology necessarily, but it, it taught me a lot about the business of tech. And so that, to me, I mean, now I look back, it's such a blessing to have gotten that opportunity. And so I just developed skills in terms of communication and understanding the tech industry. And then from there, I just was able to move from a different agency to another agency, and then I was able to move into IBM and then Salesforce, and then the opportunity for Dropbox came up. So it kind of was quite cyclical, but I do think that first opportunity while I was at university was really pivotal in really kickstarting that. So I mean, in terms of Dropbox, it was my dream job landing that, and being able to start the function from the ground up. I was the first comms person in APJ.
Oh, nice.
And it just, it was so much fun as well, and great team, great boss. And so, I mean, it's been a ride for sure. But, meeting Bree was definitely a highlight. We were colleagues first, and our friendship has really flourished over the last 2 years, because we really felt this connection when we started to see the Asian hate crimes start to really become quite prevalent. And even though it was in the US and not so prevalent here, I felt so impacted by it, because just seeing the images and reading the stories, it just reminded me that could be my grandma, that could be my grandfather, that could be my parents. And so it was just quite distressing to see that. And so we decided that you started it, the ERG group in APAC. Bree definitely led the charge in the beginning. She's just being humble, but she definitely led the charge. So ERG at Dropbox stands for Employee Resource Group, and it's voluntary. So it's a group of employees who want to rally people around heritage and culture. And so, the genesis of it is that we minority cultures tend to dilute themselves when they're in a dominant culture in the West. And so the ERG groups is really to honour the fact that, we're different and we're special and we have such rich stories. Yeah. And it's really to help Dropboxers lean into that and be proud of that. So Bree started it, and really what it was just like fun food stuff, like being Asian.
As you do.
Let's do a hawker market for API month, and it was a lot of fun. But 2 years ago, when it started to get a lot more serious and we started to see these hate crimes happening, we just decided that we need to really get the team together, get the community together and talk about this stuff, because we don't talk about it. We have a nice meal and we joke around, but we never get together and talk about deeper things like, how did you grow up? What scares you? Tell me about your upbringing. So that was really the start of it. And so we decided to just get the team together and have a dinner. And it was just like opening up this kimono, and people were super vulnerable and they shared things that I think they just wouldn't have shared otherwise. So it was a great bonding experience, and we've continued that now. So we do an annual dinner with our Asians At group. We just had our second one last month. And it just gets better and better. It's I think people just feel more comfortable sharing, and we just learn so much more about each other in an environment that we wouldn't have had the chance to do that.
Sounds like you almost have to, I feel like common theme is you have to actually facilitate conversations.
You do.
I feel like Asians just aren't forthcoming about opening up, right? And particularly here in Australia, which I want to ask Bree also about what your opinion is between Asian Americans and Asian Australians, is that we have tall poppy syndrome here where, whoever's the tallest and the loudest gets mown down. And then when you stack that on top of Asian culture, which is to put your head down, work hard, you talk about how, that as an MO is probably not enough, that I think there is, that's the probably most obvious difference for me when I sort of look at Asian Americans and what's happening over there versus what's happening here. But I think like Bree, you'd be like the perfect person to obviously talk about that. What are you seeing in terms of the differences between the two? Because before we started recording, one of the things you mentioned was just to see how, we're lagging behind here in Australia talking about this sort of stuff or doing things about this. But I feel like also COVID has somewhat accelerated that as well, not just in the US, but here as well with Asian hate crime. And I sort of, as, for me, the first experience that I sort of was like really, I had a big reaction to, and I mentioned this before in another podcast, was when I saw footage of two girls walking around, and young girls in Marrickville, and they got spat on. And this was like right at the start of the pandemic. And it was just like, I was like, what the hell is this,
Yeah.
And so that was the first time I was very worked up by it. But just going back to sort of the question for you, Bree, is like, what's your thoughts, I guess? I know it's a loaded question, but how do you see that between the two countries?
I'll start on the macro level and then go into like the Asian specific question. In my experiences kind of living in the US and then moving here, I would say there can be a feeling of more individualism in the way that Americans think and operate. And here there's a lot more collectivism. And so it's interesting in the way it comes to life, first and foremost as a marketer, and then I'll get into how as an Asian American, Asian Australian. But from a marketing perspective, for example, things I had to learn when I moved here were things like the humor is very different. There's not this chest beating culture of we're number one, to your point. That marketing does not work here. You just got to be good and, do good work. So I think culturally they're very different. They have very different histories as well. I would say here there's been a lot more conversations around First Nations, which has been very deeply rooted in the history of Australia, where I'd say Americans there's a lot with Blacks, with Asians, with a lot of minorities that have all immigrated into what is now this melting pot. And there's so much work to do, as you can see from the news in the US, because it's like systemic challenges that are happening that are not fixed, that have affected inequalities that are spanning generations that they can't undo. So I would say in the US, they're definitely further along in terms of the activism. I think to your point, because of the tall poppy syndrome, in the US, the opposite is actually true, which they're okay to be loud, they're okay to be active, they're okay to, speak their voices in an environment where that's encouraged and supported. I would say as well, maybe it's not been the number one minority agenda here, so it's actually a little slower here, but I think Leigh and I talk about this all the time. We're all with what we're doing at the beginning, and we need to start having more voices, more people supporting this. And I think it starts with these opportunities like this podcast of just sharing your story, sharing your journey, and bringing folks along who are curious and open and want to be part of that too.
Yeah. And then you obviously talk about you yourself being Asian American. What do you feel like the Americans are doing really well, the Asian Americans are doing really well, that we should probably take a leaf out of here?
Yeah. It's interesting. So last year, actually 2 years ago, I joined this AAPI marketing leaders community. And it's about now 200 marketers around the world, but mostly based in America. And they have the hard conversations. So yeah, of course, to what Leigh's point was in the early days, it's like, yay, we're all Asian and we're all leaders and like, let's band together, But then, now the conversation has evolved into true impact. So these folks are marketing leaders at Facebook, at Netflix, at all these different companies that are actually making change in the world. And the media, and we can get into this later, how media has influenced the way that people think of societal norms. If you are an Asian marketer with a seat at the table as a leader, you can change the narrative of a Netflix series, of the way that marketing is portrayed, what normal looks like. And so I think there's been the benefit that I've seen firsthand from that community is being able to actually use your stories and your voices to influence the actual decisions that are made and the perception that is then put in the market. I don't see many of those communities here. And I think maybe it's up to us and people like us to start those and figure out what are those key areas that the community needs support from and how can we be a voice for that. But we've got a long way to go, I think, here. And,
I totally agree. I don't think there's enough Asian leaders that are, at the point of decision-making or influencing decision-making within corporations and businesses. And so I think that's where the US does so much better than Australia. But one thing I was thinking about this question, and I think that we have to remember that when we think about the influx of Asian people who came to Australia, still relatively short period of time. Like I think about my parents, like 30 to 40 years. Yeah. And so really we're only dealing with like the next generation or the next generation. So we're still very early on in that, I think, transformation and the reinvention of what it is to be a Vietnamese or an Asian Australian. Whereas I think the US has had a bit more time to really kind of, ramp that up.
I'd say most of us are like second generation.
Yeah.
Right. So it'd be really interesting to see, the proverbial third culture.
Yeah. I'm excited.
Yeah.
I'm excited
Yeah.
because this didn't exist when I was growing up. These conversations, these types of podcasts. And I'm so delighted that these conversations are getting surfaced now and that young people can be engaged and they can have an opinion and they can have a voice and they can feel like I can be part of this. I can raise my voice. I can have an opinion, which is not something that I really grew up with. So
I think we definitely spend, like we had Leigh on the show and she talks about how the last 10 or 15 years or whatever you want to call it was like Asians were really focused on just getting to the table.
Yep.
And then now we're there. It's like now we get to actually have an impact and have a say, right?
Yeah.
And, one of the things for me was that it's not always about like us versus them, echo chamber, this sort of stuff. You have to be very, how do I say, like you have to collaborate and you have to bring people who aren't us to believe in us and support us in order for us to impact change. And I think Asians definitely have self-limiting beliefs. I know this was a discussion point as well when we were sort of preparing for the podcast. And that is that we talk about bamboo ceiling, self-limiting beliefs and that sort of stuff. So Leigh, I'd be curious to get your opinion on that because you're in a leadership position. And I feel like even when I was going through corporate, I did 10 years of corporate and it was very much so self-limiting beliefs. It's like, I just want to come in and do my job. I want to do a good job and I don't want to beat my chest. I don't want to be too loud about it as well. And that's probably a common theme across a lot of Asians coming through. But yet for you to get to maybe drawing from either your personal experience or advice, what would you say to that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind. So I was asked this question or a similar question on a panel recently. And when I thought about my journey in terms of integrating and assimilating and what that's meant to me, I would say I wouldn't be so proud of how I handled the whole situation. I would say that when I think about assimilation, there's healthy assimilation, which is, minority cultures blending in with majority cultures, and together you build a new culture and everyone can participate in that. It's different. It doesn't belong to, one culture versus the other. So that's healthy. The unhealthy part of assimilation is when the minority group actually ignores or even rejects their own cultural markers because they want to fit in with the larger culture. And I would say I did that for a big part of my career and probably during my school years as well. So I don't have the right sort of, these are the toolkits and you do this and tick these boxes and you'll be fine. But for me, it's still a journey. I've just realized it recently. It makes me very sad that I felt that that's how I had to move in the world. That's how I had to survive. And that's how that's what I had to do to find success, which is not true. But, it's very common within minority communities that, we sort of reject what makes us different and unique because we want to be seen as, Western and
well, one of the things for me, I remember like going through corporate was you had to have common interests and more often than not, it wasn't necessarily anything that we were interested in. Like, I'm a guy and I grew up here. I grew up in the West, which is a big rugby league culture. And so like sports was always like this thing that I could always latch to have commonality with people. But a lot of people don't watch sports, particularly in the Asian sort of community, right? They don't have any interest in it. And did you have to navigate, I guess the question is like, how did you navigate through it as Asian female, trying to work your way up and then trying to, it's all, we talk about nepotism, like who you need to know and building your way up. Did you what was that struggle like, if at all, when you were?
So I would say I was very lucky in that I had a lot of female leaders when I was going through my career. So they weren't Asian, but they were female. And so for me, that was something I could relate to. I saw female leaders and I saw that they were powerful and they were smart and influential. And so I felt like that part of me was satisfied in terms of, okay, I think I can make it. But what I will say is that what I've realized recently is, there's a secret to it, which is muscle memory. And we have to acknowledge that as Asians, we're not grown up and we're not sort of taught by our parents to have this muscle memory around being confident, having a voice, having an opinion. It's not something that is very culturally almost like acceptable within, Asian families, because it's not about you, it's about the family, it's about the collective community. And so we don't grow up with a lot of that. We don't have the muscle memory in order to do that. So for me, an example that I talk about sometimes is I get invited. I'm very lucky. I get invited to our CEO's leadership offsite that he holds twice a year. I'm the only person from the region that gets to go to that. And I feel obviously very fortunate to be included, but every single time, I've been going for a number of years now, every single time in the lead up, I have this like meltdown. I just like, it's when my imposter syndrome like flares up like overdrive. And I have these thoughts where I'm like, why am I even going? Like everyone's super senior. They have massive teams, have massive remits. Why am I there? Maybe I shouldn't go. I'll just make up an excuse and just not be there. So it's a really weird like thought process. And a couple of years ago, I just decided that in that moment, I can like go into this small world of mine of imposter syndrome and feel like I don't deserve to be there and I should just like go under the radar, maybe just turn up, don't say anything, and just kind of, enjoy it. So I could do that, or I can almost like rise to meet the opportunity. It's such an amazing opportunity to be at that event and to be at the table, to be invited. And so I had to realize just how amazing that opportunity is and how can I rise to meet it. And so I made this deal with myself that I would show up and I would show up so well. And so I have this love-hate relationship with Q&A time. So it's like Q&A time. I'm like, I'm going to ask a question because that's how I get myself out of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I have to force myself to like get the put my hand up, get the microphone and like verbalize the question. And, every single time I'm like, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it because no one's asking questions. It's like silent and no one's asking questions. I'm like, I don't want to be the first. But
you have to be.
I force myself to do it because I want the muscle memory.
Yeah.
I want to build the ability and almost like the knowledge that I can do it. And the thing I tell my teams is, Q&A time it's your chance to not just ask a good question. I think people get so caught up in, I don't have a good question and I need to really think about the good question. Don't worry about the question because no one remembers the question you ask. They just remembered that you asked a question. But most importantly, you will remember that you asked a question. And you're going to be able to do that again. And you're going to be able to build the courage and know that I'm brave and I can do it. And each time it gets easier. It's still scary. Right? But it gets easier and easier and you have the memory in order to do that.
This episode is produced and brought to you by Social Wave. Social Wave is a strategic content marketing agency helping businesses grow revenue using video, podcasts, and SEO. Head on over to socialwave.com.au to find out more. Now back to the show. I was just going to say, like, that's really important for a lot of people out there as well. Especially, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but especially with social media, you see everyone stepping up to the game and then there's that imposter syndrome because everyone's doing all these amazing things and how come I can't do the same thing or how come I can't be famous and speak up for who I am? I'm a little bit curious about just in terms of ERG, what was that impact like in terms of starting it and bringing that to the company and I guess pitching the idea, or were you guys given the space just to be able to start it and you just had the community already in the workplace to go from there?
We had it to begin with, actually.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'll let Bree talk about it because she really spearheaded it in APAC. But it existed. So we're fortunate in that Dropbox is, so generous and so thoughtful about culture and minority groups.
Yeah, it did exist. And to Leigh's point, I think it's something that we created our own flavor and flair to for the region based on what we were listening to folks. So we'd have some deep chats one-on-one with the folks and saying like, what do you need like right now in this moment? What would support look like? What does allyship look like? And that's when we made the big call. I'm like, yeah, we could use this budget to make everyone else excited about another hawker market, or we could use it for basically what became group therapy, to be honest, on some topics. And I think everyone just left with this feeling of knowing each other better on a different level. And what I mean by that is typically when you're in a work setting, you bond over the fact that you're on the same team or you have similar personalities. Like we're all outgoing. Okay, cool. All the people that do typically go to the social events are the ones that become close. But when you bond over being Asian, it's not just being those things. It's like a whole different dimension of your upbringing and identity. And it's been interesting for Leigh and I because a lot of topics came up that we were like, whoa, we did not know these were really big issues. Like, for example, standards of beauty. Do you remember our first lunch or first dinner? The men were so vocal about this topic around the fact that growing up, there weren't a lot of examples of hot Asian men in films. And now we're getting there. But like, that is such a struggle to be, you know, perceived in this box of being small and weak and all these things, and how much that messes with their ego, their sense of self, their confidence, and that how that translates into a work setting. And for women, I was telling Leigh, I grew up with watching The Bachelor. Americans have The Bachelor and Bachelorette as well. Yeah, the Batchy, good old Batchy, you know. And then you see growing up, all of a sudden, there's all these women that get picked that are the Southern charming belle with the blonde hair, blue eyes, skinny. And you start to get familiar with this idea that, oh, they get picked. They're the like example of beauty and what that standard looks like. So that was like a really interesting topic. Another one that came up that we've talked a lot about is this concept called the crab bucket theory. I don't know if y'all have heard about it. It is basically like when you grow up being the only in any situation, you feel like there's not space for anyone else. And it's like crabs in a bucket where people step over each other to get out of the bucket. And I think what Leigh was saying earlier is like, you have to almost undo and build these new muscle memory areas around confidence, around sense of self, and know that there can be space for many. And you can live in a world where everyone supports each other instead of stepping on each other to think that's a scarcity model. And yeah, it's just been an interesting journey. And I think Leigh and I have gotten so close as well because it's therapy for us. Like, I think we're going back in time to all these stories and moments that have shaped us that maybe we haven't faced, and reworking like what the journey and the story will be moving forward because of it.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on the point that you brought around self-limiting beliefs. And I think it's really important in my own reflection that, you know, it's easy to fall into victimhood and victim mentality where it's like the world's against us and it's just been really hard and tough. And that's a nice narrative. I mean, it's, you know, it's a nice story to tell in your head and to make excuses or, you know, to try and explain why certain things haven't happened for you. And yes, it is harder when you're different and you don't have a lot of the privileges available, but, you know, it's not a helpful mentality to stay in. And so I think that, you know, there's mental models that we start to develop when we're in that headspace that, well, there's only so much that's available. And it's scarcity mentality, right? It's because you don't see someone that looks like you or has grown up like you in a space that you want to be, you just think it's not possible, or there's only one slice of the pie for someone like me. And I think it's, you know, and you see this in many minority groups, not just Asians. I think women, you know, feel this as well. And I think it, you know, it's not as prevalent in communities where, you know, there are more dominant cultures. There's more of a feeling of abundance. And I think abundance can be a really powerful way to think about how can we all lift each other up. There's room for all of us. And I was talking to my brother the other day. He made like this really profound comment, and he said, you know, the fitness industry, it's like really thriving, right? And everyone supports each other.
Yeah.
And it's very, I mean, it's very energetic and people love being part of it. It's a great community. And the reason for that, I think, is because, you know, when you are getting fit and getting strong and getting healthier, you're doing it for yourself.
Yep.
And if someone's getting fit, right? And if someone's getting fitter, it doesn't take away from you. It's not like limited fitness that I have, you know.
You're all fat except for me.
Exactly. It's like everyone can be fit, strong, and healthy, and you're really just competing with yourself. Who you were yesterday, who you were last month, a year ago, and you can all lift each other up. And so I just think there's a lot that we can learn from that, even that industry and that just that headspace that people have when they're, you know, they're working out or they're getting themselves healthier, because it's everyone can do it. It's available.
Yeah, I think it comes from a lot of like we were talking about how the older generation, because they're so in survival mode when they come here.
Yes.
There's no other way. There's only one slice of the pie for them. That's what they feel. Going off of that though, and like with that growth, especially now that our generation is able to see, we do have more opportunities. And I know you both mentioned like it did take a little while to get there. You do feel ashamed previously when you didn't embrace your culture as much and your roots. But in the tech industry, for example, and a lot of corporate industries, have you felt like there have been a few struggles being women or climbing the ladder? And can you touch on that experience as well?
I don't know if I can call on any specific examples, but I guess it's that feeling of not being completely yourself and not feeling like you could bring your whole self to a work situation. I remember, just talking to colleagues about what I did on the holidays, and I'd say, I went to the beach. I spent my time at the beach, but really I went like one day. And the rest of the time I was at home or at my grandma's place making dumplings, or doing like really Asian things. Yeah. And it wasn't that I was like lying. It was just more this feeling of like I had to conceal who I was, or I had to hide, what I actually loved doing and how I loved spending my time, because it didn't fit the mold of, what is accepted as normal and regular, I suppose. I wanted to be normal and regular. So I think that was a struggle. But again, I think it's so much of it is, it goes back to self-limiting beliefs, because had I opened up, had I said, I actually spent the whole holidays making dumplings with my grandma. Yeah. That could have opened up such a wonderful conversation, right? Of like learning from each other, but I didn't do that. And I don't really know where that comes from. I think we still try and explore this. Like, is it us? Is it like
society?
Is it us or is it society? Don't know. But I think that, I wish that I had more confidence and more comfort in who I was at the beginning.
Definitely.
I would also add, like, I think a lot of my challenges as well are not so much other people as much as my self-limiting beliefs and how I navigate that through these different stages of our careers and life. One pivotal moment for me, I think in my 20s, I think it was like 25 or something. I remember I got my first 360 review and everyone was like, Bree is nice. And I was like, oh, this is not a Miss Congeniality contest. This is a business review. Like, and I didn't realize that I had like put myself in this vanilla, like put your head down, just do the work, just be kind, just be considerate, just like don't step on any toes, don't rustle any feathers, just like do the thing. And I lost in like every element of myself, like all these elements that were sassy and silly and whatever. And to Leigh's point, it's like you don't feel like you can bring that full self. And so now like my biggest challenge is how do you marry yourself as an individual in your personal and professional life? And I will tell you, it's so much less exhausting. Like I was exhausted at the end of a workday when you had to feel like on and there was like this work Bree and then this personal Bree. Like the happiness is when all of that is in parity, like your values and the way you carry yourself and who you are all the same at work as you are at home. So, and it's still a journey. I don't think it's perfect. We go through it every week. I'm like, something's aligned. We talk about it, misaligned. it's just an ongoing course correct, I guess.
And as you were talking, I had this thought that it's easy to say we come from this background and, we just work hard and we don't have opinions, but we shouldn't reject that either, because with that comes some really wonderful things. It's humility, it's thoughtfulness, it's caring about other people, it's having empathy. Like those are really wonderful qualities that come from, an Asian upbringing. It comes from Asian values, not exclusively Asian values, but it comes from that collective mindset. And what I am working through now is how do I make that a strength? Yeah. How do I lean into those qualities and actually make it an asset for myself as a leader, right? Because I do think that the world of leadership is changing. We are recognizing that vulnerability, empathy, and servant leadership. They're actually, it's different styles to leadership. And I think we've just been conditioned to see one style of leadership for a long time. Very masculine, macho, like winner takes all, black and white. And we're so conditioned to seeing that as the model for leadership. And I think we're seeing just different styles now. That is a little bit more open, it's more fluid, it's more feminine in energy. And so I think that there's, it's exciting. And I would encourage young people who are, working through their careers to don't abandon those things, because they're really important and you can use them as strengths, particularly in this new world that's emerging.
Yeah, I think emotional intelligence is probably the biggest thing that I've noticed, at least through what I've been doing, both running as a business, but also, being managed, like as in being a staff member and having leaders versus being a leader as well. And that is to have the ability to be able to, I guess, sense and feel, the different personalities within your team, getting the best out of them and that sort of stuff. And I think we've seen that much better because, I certainly remember first starting out very masculine, although I'm male myself. But I felt like there was also a lot of, and this was only my microcosm experience working in the hotel industry, there was a lot of leadership with fear. There was a lot of, sort of macho, sort of you do this, I tell you type thing. And over time, I've seen that really soften. And then I remember first having, my first female manager, and it was a much softer approach because I'd historically always had male bosses. And so that was really different for me. And then obviously the transformation into how there's such a big emphasis, particularly I feel like the tech industry's really led that for company culture. Like culture is such a really important thing. And I think I would say it's the most important thing when it comes to business because, your people are your culture. I've got a really curious question, particularly for Bree as well. I sort of think back to growing up and going through like we talk about traveling. Traveling was a very formative thing for me because when I remember first going back to China and for the first time not actually going back with family, but literally going by myself, it was like this very mind-blowing experience of just going, wow, like everyone here, good or bad habits, is like me, right?
Yeah.
And I'll probably ask both of you, I'll start with Bree. Have you had the chance to go back to Korea? And if so, did you feel like what was that experience like for you?
So I actually had a trip booked before the pandemic hit to go visit Jung Kwan. Obviously, if you guys have seen Chef's Table, she's a monk who did this amazing feast, but also go back and explore my roots. And unfortunately, we haven't had a chance to do that trip. We're planning to reschedule it. But I think it's been more interesting actually going back home to like my parents' place after 2 years away where you haven't seen them and you've changed a lot and kind of taking them on the journey of all the changes you've had and a lot of the racial conversations that we've talked about today that I didn't even know were things in my head 2 years ago. So that was quite confronting and it took some time for my parents to adjust. They're very open and incredible people, but I think talking and pushing these topics, it was actually really interesting. About 3 months ago, we were back for a friend's wedding in Austin, Texas with my parents. And I was in a taxi cab with my mom and the driver was saying, where are you from? No, like, where are you from? In a very aggressive way to my mom. And it wasn't something that was curious or open. It was very like, y'all know how it's done. And I was getting fired up. And at the end of the cab ride, I got out and I was like, Mom, why didn't you say anything? And she's like, why would I step below like my level? Like he's never going to be at our level. So why would I try to step down from it? It's so graceful. And here I am and I'm like thinking, oh my God, like our generation has gotten so fired up about this that we're like overcompensating for the former generations. And it was just this moment where I'd never like stood up for race in front of my mom. But then I also realized there's a time and a place for when you do that. And so that was like a moment in time where I was like, okay, like I need to figure out like what the power level of these things is and at what point. Exactly. Pick your battles. So that was one formative moment of being home. But I would say now it's been beautiful now that we feel more confident sharing and talking about these things, the conversations we've had with even allies. We actually hosted a panel yesterday for API month, a bit delayed. And it was an amazing energy where we joked around about like common stereotypes of different types of Asians and people had a chance to have a laugh, but then also talk about ways we'd love for allies to hang out with us, like come to meals with us, try different restaurants, be curious, all these things. So I think to answer your question, like there's been a lot of growth for me as well as like moments where my family and I are trying to like relearn each other in these different ways. But then also in the context of like the workplace that we're kind of learning a lot.
And then for you, Leigh, I guess in terms of, have you had the opportunity to say go back to Vietnam and sort of experience what was that like for you?
I have. I love Vietnam. I feel this deep connection to it. I can't explain it. And I think, maybe we've all experienced that when we go back to where our parents lived and where they were born and how they grew up. And so my mum actually took us back for the first time when we were still in high school. And looking back for me, it was like, oh, it's just like a holiday or whatever. But for her, it was this really big deal. She was introducing her children to her entire family. She was the only person that actually came over from Vietnam. So her entire family was still there. And so it was this moment where she was like, I really want you to meet my family. And I remember that I'm getting emotional. I remember she said, what do you think of my family?
Oh, she asked.
She asked, when we were in Vietnam, and she said, what do you think of my family? And it was just this moment where I now look back and I just think it was so important for her, for us to experience that.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Absolutely. And I can't fathom my mum asking me that question, like not to make it lighthearted, but certainly, I mean, it probably goes to show that your mum has a very soft personality and she's just a very sweet person in general. And it's very important for her. Like I think we sort of, when we talk about Asian mums particularly, very domesticated, very like their role is to bring up the household, right? So their whole life revolves around it. And I think too, even recently sort of talking to my mom about it, now that we've all moved out of home, there was a little while where she lost her purpose and she like didn't know what to do with her life. She had so much spare time. She was living in this big 6-bedroom house and it was just like her and my dad.
Yeah.
But certainly I think going back to like Leigh's story, it's very, family is like the most important thing for them, right?
Yeah.
And so that's insane, like for her to ask you that.
And I think it just came from a place of like, I really, I want you to know how I grew up. This is my life. What do you think of it?
Do you remember how you answered her?
I think I said, they're cool. I was in high school. I just couldn't even like fathom like why. Yeah, they're fine. They're fun. But now when I look back, it was this moment for her to reveal her life, like this life that she couldn't share with us for so long.
Yeah.
And and so I met her brothers and sisters and I could see her in them.
Yeah, wow.
It was so weird. I was like, you look so much like your sister, It was just, I was staring at like a twin or something. And so, it was incredible. And I've been back a couple of times since then. But what I also noticed that was interesting when I was back there is that, Vietnamese culture and probably a lot of Asian culture, it's very subtle, non-verbal. You sort of have to do a lot of guessing. Like, I think that's what they want. Not telling me, but the bodily cues are like, I'm trying to read this situation. And so I think that's why, to your point about emotional intelligence, that's how we develop it because nothing's obvious. Yeah. Sometimes you just want, just tell me like, what is it? Yeah. But it's very subtle and it's very gentle and it's like, you'll get there. If you really understand what I want, like you'll get there. It's sort of that kind of, softly. And I do think there's something really wonderful about it. There's something really warm and gentle, about that.
For sure.
culture.
Like I remember going back and I was like, first time, I think I was like 7 years old. And it was like people I'd never met in my life, but they treated me like family, like, cause they were family, but it was like, 7-year-old brain was like, you don't know me. Like, who are you? And you're like just grappling with all this hospitality. Like it's like almost like this overbearing hospitality. And I think back and I was like, God, I was ungrateful. I was like terrible, like I didn't want a bar of it. I didn't want anyone to touch me. I was very much so like that, like I hadn't met my grandparents. That was the first time I met them. And it was,
who are these people? Like, don't touch me.
That's right.
Feeding you up to your esophagus and then more.
Exactly. Right. It's like, why are you still feeding me food? I don't want any more food.
I know. And the multi-generational thing, though, is actually a really good point, though, you bring up, because I think it's something, I don't know if you guys have read the book Pachinko or seen the new Apple TV show, but it basically explores like 4 generations of a Korean family that lived in Japan and then also some that moved to America. And it ties in all these layers of like gender and trauma and projections of things that happen in previous generations. And it's really interesting when you open up all these things, you realize, and when you go see a therapist, they go back to like your childhood and their parents' childhood and all these things, but you realize like all the things that make up who you are also multi-generational elements from like your grandparents' trauma, going through things like, having nothing, or my Korean grandparents with the Korean War and not knowing when their next meal is. Like all these things then create different dynamics in the way that you are, whether it's like a fear-based mentality or like a quiet, like introverted, like let's just like put our head down and do the work thing. Like I think it's so interesting to ask those questions and continue exploring further back than just your parents to really understand that.
I just wanted to backtrack a little bit. I'm a little bit curious to know, did you speak to your mom about that experience with how you feel now versus how you responded back when you were in high school?
No.
You haven't spoken to
It's not what Asians do.
We don't do that. We're Asian. And honestly, like, I didn't even think about it until you asked me the question about first time back in Vietnam. Like, I have very fond memories of it. I remember meeting, my relatives for the first time, but it wasn't even a thought until now. So maybe I will have that conversation with my mum.
Wow.
Yeah.
Starting the
Thanks for making me realize how important that moment was.
Yeah.
It is very important. And the thing I think about when you say that is also, there's actually a very well-known American blogger called Tim Urban. I don't know if you know his name, but he's got a website called Wait But Why. And I did show my team this. He writes these very long, like I'm talking book length posts, blog posts. And he draws these really funny stick figures, like just to complement his stories. And one of them was called The Tail End. And it was he drew these like interesting charts, and he would show you visually one of the charts was how much time you've actually got left with your parents. And it was like, that's why it's called the tail end, because by the time you get through high school, university, college, and then go into your working profession, you're already at the tail end in terms of the time between you and your parents. And I think a lot of Asian, I guess of our age, sort of second generation, you're in the peak of your professional career. You're very aspirational, you're very ambitious. You're always looking forward, that we actually, before we know it, like it's like, oh, we're at the tail end. And so I have to constantly remind myself, and that's why I probably spend a lot more time now with my parents than I did maybe 5 or 10 years ago, because I was trying to tick things off the list. I was trying to, achieve the things I wanted to. So I think it's really important for people to understand that it's like your parents aren't going to live forever. Like they are people as well. And it's like pachinko and all this sort of stuff, just to see how you rekindle it. And I remember my mom even telling me, she says, you should consider tracing your roots, because I think as Asians, we're very big on legacy, like in terms of family lineage, but we also don't do a very good job. Well, not some of us don't do. Certainly my family don't. I don't know beyond my grandparents who my relatives are. I don't know if that's the same for you girls, but it's like unless I ask my parents, even my parents don't even know. So I guess I'm sort of just wrapping that all up because I feel like it's important to talk about like, your relationship with your parents, because like our parents have their own level of trauma. They're like not great communicators,
and they don't know how to communicate it either.
No,
exactly.
It's a generational issue for them as well. Sort of just to steer it in a slightly different direction, because both you ladies work for Dropbox. You're in tech as well. Tech is now a very attractive career option. Like everyone wants to work for tech, right? Do you have any advice, and I'm happy to open it to either of you, in terms of anyone, particularly Asians, female, right? Because they would obviously relate to you, who want to get into tech, whether it's for Dropbox or some other thing. Any words of wisdom or advice in terms of getting into this industry?
I definitely think be proactive. And if I think about the that first opportunity I had at that PR agency while I was at university, it literally was me looking at a job ad on the community wall or board at my university and applying for the job. And I think, had I not done that, had I not been proactive and looked for it, it wouldn't have happened. And so I do think proactivity is one. And once you get your foot in the door in tech, you can stay there. I mean, it's that kind of industry. It's, it's very welcoming. It's very generous, and it's, there's so much happening as well. It's expanding all the time. It's huge. But I think it's, getting your foot in the door and just being proactive about opportunities. Once you get your first start, it'll all happen from there. I know that's like very kind of vague, but I'll start there, and if I can come up with something a bit more helpful.
Bree?
Yeah, I love this question because I've been reflecting on it a lot in my quarter life crisis of pandemic times. But like I think now we're at a point where Leigh and I are trying to be the person we wish our younger self had in a lot of ways. And I think mentorship is actually a really interesting way to approach it. I remember back when LinkedIn had just started, I was hustling and finding anyone who would do a 30-minute coffee with me. I would pay for their coffee and just ask them a ton of questions and just, to Leigh's point, being really proactive. But also look for mentors. Like maybe there's a ton of people like myself. I'm looking to start mentoring younger women who are Asian and have gone through similar journeys as I have. So just reach out and be bold. I think for me as well, I have had a lot of mentors throughout my career and I'm very grateful for that. But more recently, I've been intentional with who is my mentor. So I actually just got my first Asian female mentor.
Nice.
And then I actually just got an executive coach and I asked, I want an Asian female executive coach. There was only one in the network, but we're getting there.
Baby steps.
Yeah, baby steps. But it was just so nice to start to look at it from a lens of being more clear with who I was and what my values were and then what things I need to learn. And to your point earlier, it's important to still have allies along that journey. It's not like I've canned all my other mentors in this journey, but I think equally it's so nice to just have my first chat with this Asian female mentor. She and I talked for 3 hours and it was just race and culture and identity and like all these things that we're talking about, but in the context of how it comes up at work and personal and whatnot. So I just would encourage folks to continue looking for leaders that they would like to be like one day, follow them, ask them questions, offer to take them a coffee. I think people wouldn't say no.
Yeah.
I have a better answer. I've listened to Bree give an amazing answer. So I would say use social media to your advantage, right? So we are living in an age where everyone can have a voice and everyone can have a platform and a profile. And I would say within tech, it's an industry that values points of views, unique thinking, unique points of views, and a narrative. So if you can work out what your story is and what your opinion is on certain things, on the industry, Web3, crypto, whatever it is, there's so much that's happening right now, so much newness that's like entering the industry. Have an opinion. Put it out there. And, you'd be surprised at how much of that can bubble up and reach the right people that are in positions to make decisions about hiring and job opportunities. So I know it's not natural, like I said, muscle memory. It's not a lot of muscle memory for, people of Asian background to like put their neck out and like put out this opinion and, be super controversial on things like Twitter and LinkedIn. But obviously be respectful, but if you have a strong opinion and it's really interesting, it will capture attention. So, that's a hot tip. I wish I did more of that when I was starting at my
It goes back to that whole point of you saying like hard work sometimes is enough, right? Like you have to have the connections. It's about like, also it's cliche. It's like who you know, not what you know. And I think it's just, even if you think about what you mentioned about the asking questions in Q&A, like if you make yourself visible and you get noticed, who knows what will happen. And I sort of always say, and I've had to train this into myself now with running a business for the last 2 years, which is, like you create your own luck. Luck is just preparation meets opportunity. But if you don't be proactive and you go and take those first initial steps, then you aren't creating any opportunity for yourself, which is, I think, the biggest struggle amongst Asians, where they come through this very regimented pathway and thinking that at each stage there will be another door that opens up on the other side. And then when that door doesn't open, you're kind of screwed. Like you don't know what to do, right? And I think that happens very much so usually, I find, at the end of university, right? Or like partway through tertiary education. And, sort of to your point, Leigh, about the internship and that sort of stuff, you're like, holy shit, this is not going to plan.
You just need one opportunity. You just need that first opportunity, and then doors will open for you.
Exactly.
But getting to that opportunity requires, initiation. It requires being proactive. You have to try. You have to go to the interviews and you have to put your application out there. So work really hard and land that first one. And then, if you're good, you have to be good and talented as well. It's merit-based. It's very merit-based industry, right? Yeah. So you've got to be good and you've got to be talented and work hard. But, maybe work out a strategy. What's your strategy in getting that first step in the door, that first opportunity? What does that look like? What do you have to do in order to do that?
Yeah, I think that's really important as well, because being proactive, you just don't know unless you try. Yeah. And unless you try, you just don't know.
Be okay with rejection.
Exactly.
I got rejected like a ton of times. Just build a thick skin and just get over it and go for the next one, and eventually something will land.
Yeah. And I think representation is really important as well, especially in the space, having women leaders, so that, like you said, you had a 3-hour conversation and it's just these little cultural nuances that you wouldn't otherwise have or be able to understand with someone who looks like you or has had the same experiences. Thank you, both of you, so much for coming onto the podcast today and sharing vulnerable stories, experiences, and how to step up and create a voice for other people as well in the space. If people are looking to connect with you or find out more resources, how can they find you online?
I'm only on LinkedIn. I'm not on social media. So you can send me a request, but I only respond to personal requests, not ones that are blank. So obviously share something about yourself and your journey and why you're wanting to connect. But LinkedIn's the place.
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. I dabble in Twitter as well, so I'm there. But I'd say if people wanted to connect professionally, LinkedIn is probably the best.
Great. And we'll link those in the show notes as well. But thank you both for coming on today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Level Asian podcast. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode. And why not share it with friends and family who might enjoy it too? Also, make sure you head over to levelasianpodcast.com to join our email list and to receive the latest updates and get notified when the next episode drops. If you know a great guest we should feature, email us at contact@levelasianpodcast.com or DM us on our socials in the show notes. Catch you on the next episode.